You begin with an assumption you rarely examine: the belief that your knowledge is reliable simply because it feels coherent. You trust your conclusions because they appear consistent, and you trust consistency because it feels safe. But if you pause and observe the process behind this trust, the foundation becomes unclear. You rely on the mind to judge truth, yet you seldom question whether the mind itself is qualified to do so. Al-Ghazali confronted this tension at the beginning of his inquiry. He noticed that the mind often confuses familiarity with certainty, habit with truth, and coherence with validity. When you look closely at your own reasoning, you see how easily confidence forms without verification. This raises the first question: what grounds your certainty if the instrument of certainty is unexamined? Al-Ghazali lived in a world dominated by intellectual confidence. Philosophers debated metaphysics, jurists refined legal theory, theologians defended doctrine, and mystics explored inner experience. Baghdad was a center of scholarship, where argument shaped reputation and knowledge signified authority. Within this environment, Al-Ghazali noticed a shared assumption: that reason could reach certainty if applied carefully enough. Yet this assumption itself had not been tested. When he examined it, he found that even the most skilled thinkers depended on the same unverified instrument: the mind that evaluates itself. As Al-Ghazali analyzed logic, theology, and philosophy, he recognized that each discipline assumed the reliability of the mind. Logic depends on mental clarity, theology depends on interpretive reasoning, philosophy depends on abstract thought. But none of these can secure the validity of the very tool they employ. You see the same problem when you examine your own understanding. You assume that your thoughts reflect what is real, but this assumption cannot be proven using the thoughts themselves. When the mind attempts to verify itself, it enters a loop. For Al-Ghazali, this realization created a crisis. If every path to certainty depends on a potentially unreliable instrument, where does certainty begin? Reason is valuable. It can expose contradictions, clarify concepts, and refine arguments. But Al-Ghazali realized that reason cannot anchor itself. It cannot step outside its own structure to verify the reliability of that structure. You experience this limit when you question your most confident conclusions and discover that their foundations rest on assumptions you have never examined. Reason can show what follows from a premise, but it cannot justify the premise absolutely. It can analyze, but it cannot escape its dependence on the mind that produces it. This does not weaken reason, it simply reveals its scope. Beyond that scope, something else is required. Al-Ghazali concluded that certainty does not depend only on reasoning but also on the state of the one who reasons. If perception is distorted by desire, fear, pride, or habit, then even accurate reasoning will lead to partial conclusions. You recognize this when you notice how easily your preferences influence your interpretations. For Al-Ghazali, the heart, the inner faculty of direct apprehension, must be cleared before truth can be recognized. The heart functions as a mirror of awareness. When clouded, its reflection is distorted. When clear, it reflects what is real without alteration. You begin to see that knowledge is not only a cognitive event but also a condition of being. The quality of the knower shapes the quality of what is known. Doubt, for Al-Ghazali, was not a failure but a method. He treated doubt as a tool to expose assumptions that appear invisible. You mirror this approach when you challenge your own certainties and notice how many of them rely on repetition rather than evidence. Doubt becomes a discipline that forces you to examine the foundations of your beliefs. Through systematic doubt, Al-Ghazali discovered that some forms of certainty collapse when questioned, while others remain untouched. These untouched truths do not rely on inference, they arise directly from awareness. Doubt, when practiced carefully, does not destroy understanding. It prepares the mind to distinguish between what is constructed and what is revealed. Understanding, as Al-Ghazali discovered, does not emerge from accumulating arguments. It arises when the mind becomes quiet enough to perceive without interference. You have moments when clarity appears unexpectedly, not because you reason more, but because inner conflict briefly subsided. In such moments, knowing feels immediate, not constructed. Al-Ghazali described this as a form of insight that cannot be forced. It does not oppose reason, it exceeds it. Reason can prepare the path, but it cannot generate insight. Insight belongs to a deeper mode of awareness that becomes accessible only when the self stops asserting its claims over understanding. To understand certainty, Al-Ghazali turned toward the structure of the self. He realized that what people typically call self is not a single entity but a collection of tendencies, memories, and learned patterns. When you examine your own thoughts, you notice that they arise without your choosing. They appear, unfold, and disappear with little control. The sense of a central thinker seems coherent only because you seldom question it. Al-Ghazali argued that the self is not the source of knowledge but the locus where knowledge appears. When the self believes it owns understanding, confusion arises. When the self becomes transparent, understanding flows without obstruction. You begin to see that the you who claims knowledge is often the same you that blocks it. This is not a psychological statement. It is a philosophical one. As long as you treat the self as an independent, reliable knower, you cannot access the deeper form of certainty that emerges when the self stops interfering. Al-Ghazali's analysis leads to a difficult question. If the self is a shifting arrangement of thoughts, impressions, and tendencies, can it serve as a stable foundation for truth? The more you investigate, the less convincing this assumption becomes. The structure of the self begins to loosen. Al-Ghazali emphasized that the clarity of understanding depends on the clarity of perception. Perception becomes clouded when you approach truth with preconceived conclusions. It becomes distorted when your motives influence your interpretations. You see this when you observe how easily your reasoning shifts to defend what you prefer rather than what is accurate. Purification, in Al-Ghazali's view, is not a moral concept alone, it is an epistemological requirement. If the instrument of knowing is distorted, then the knowledge produced by it will also be distorted. You begin to notice that the mind is shaped by many subtle forces: approval, fear, identity, habit. These forces influence what you accept as true. When the mind becomes free from these influences, even temporarily, perception sharpens. Understanding becomes less about constructing explanations and more about recognizing what is already evident. You experience this when a problem becomes clear not because you thought harder, but because something ceased interfering. For Al-Ghazali, purification opens the door to certainty because it removes what prevents truth from being seen. It does not create truth, it allows truth to appear. This shifts the focus from acquiring knowledge to becoming clear enough to receive it. The question remains: if perception becomes clear only when distortion ends, what is perception when nothing distorts it? After examining the limits of reason, the instability of the self, and the need for purified perception, Al-Ghazali arrived at a conclusion that reshaped his entire search. True understanding arises through direct awareness, not through conceptual construction. Direct awareness is not a product of thought. It is the condition in which thought appears. You experience hints of this when you observe a thought without reacting to it. In that moment, the thought is present, but it does not define you. Awareness is prior to the idea. It contains the idea but is not contained by it. Al-Ghazali realized that certainty belongs to this level of awareness. Reason can point toward it, but only awareness can reveal it. When awareness becomes primary, the self loses its central role, and understanding becomes immediate. This does not mean ignoring reason. It means recognizing that reason operates within awareness, not the other way around. You begin to sense the shift. Instead of trying to control thought, you observe it. Instead of trying to force understanding, you allow it. The stability you were searching for in concepts appears naturally when the search itself relaxes. Direct awareness is not passive. It is the ground in which clarity takes form. This raises a final question. If awareness is the ground of understanding, what is the relation between the one who is aware and the awareness itself? As you stay with direct awareness, the sense of a separate, controlling self begins to weaken. You see that thoughts arise on their own. Decisions emerge from conditions you did not choose. Preferences shift without your intention. The idea of a stable self starts to appear less like a fact and more like a convenient assumption. Al-Ghazali described this dissolution not as a loss but as clarity. When the self loosens, the conflict between what you want and what you know decreases. Understanding becomes less about controlling reality and more about recognizing your place within it. This shift creates a different mode of knowing. Instead of asserting conclusions, you witness them. Instead of claiming ownership of understanding, you allow it to unfold. The tension between the knower and the known diminishes, and a sense of alignment appears, not emotional alignment, but structural alignment. The self stops competing with what is true. You realize that the self you defend so intensely is not the self that understands. Understanding belongs to the awareness that remains when the personal claims fade. This awareness does not seek credit, control, or certainty. It simply perceives, and in its perception, truth becomes evident. What remains of the self when its claims dissolve? And who continues to know when the knower steps aside? The inquiry reaches its end. Reason has shown its limits. The self has revealed its instability. Perception has been purified. Awareness has become clear. What remains is not an answer but a condition, a quiet recognition that truth does not begin with the mind and does not depend on the identity that claims it. Al-Ghazali described this as the unveiling of certainty. It is not acquired, argued, or possessed. It appears when interference ceases. You sense that the search ends not in comprehension but in stillness. Thought becomes quiet, and awareness remains. In this stillness, one question lingers without urgency. What is truth when no one is claiming it?